Okay, we're live. Hey, Joe, I'm so glad you could take time to be here in the midst of family life.
Yeah. We're okay. We got dinner done. Got some potato leek soup, and we're good.
Nice. And it's not just in the midst of family life, but it's in the midst of wrapping up the school year as a principal at a middle school in San Francisco, right?
Yeah. Today actually was the last day of school with kids, and Friday was promotion, and it was my last promotion because I'm also resigning from being a principal. So it was like sending the kids off to ninth grade and sending Mr. Truss off to somewhere not being a principal. So it was,
Well, I think we're going to talk a little bit about that in a moment, what amazing things you're off to. But first, I want to say hi to anyone who's either watching us live. I see there are a few of you out there, or those of you who are watching us by recording. I think many more folks are going to watch us by recording. So hey to everyone. And I'm going to have you introduce yourself actually in a moment. But first, I have a few questions that I want to make sure get answered, and I keep on forgetting in my interviews. So I'm going to do them at the top rather than the bottom. So you ready? These are random questions, but they're very relevant to me and my interests. I am curious about what your favorite or least favorite class that you ever took was and why. You could choose either one of those.
All right. Yeah. Love it. I'll do two because K-12 is different than college. So K-12, I had an AP chemistry class, I think it was 12th grade, where we got to build actual molecular structure of a molecule. And ecstasy was kind of very big in the 2000s. So me and my partner built a model, big, of ecstasy. It was cool. We got to learn about it, build it, and talk about that. In college, I took this mixed race identity class. It was an American Studies department at Berkeley, and it was all about the various forms of multiracial identity and the politics and sociology of that. Best classes ever.
Wow. Okay. So question about then either one of those, how did you end up studying in either one of those classes? Like, did they have tests? Did you need to study, or did you not have to study in those classes?
Yeah, AP chemistry, hell yeah. I mean, flashcards on flashcards on flashcards. And yeah, it's done like studying for those kind of tests and midterms. So, a lot of practice problems, a lot of exercises, a lot of like making up my own questions. I was that kind of kid of like, I'm going to make up my own quiz test questions.
Oh, good.
And so that way. And in the other class, not as much studying. There was a lot more projects and like writing essays and presentations and stuff. So just practice.
Yeah. So you were naturally inclined to some pretty good study techniques, it sounds like then. If you were the kind of kid who was making up your own test questions, that's like cream of the crop study technique there. Nice.
Yeah. So I don't know, somebody explained that to me and it worked, and I still do that kind of stuff.
Well, and finally in this little series, I want to know, because I know you are a busy man these days with lots of stuff going on, do you have a time management technique that is really working for you to share with us? It's okay if you don't, but if you do.
Yeah, I do. Just Google Calendar. That's it. For me, if it's not on my calendar, it is not happening, or not happening well. But for me, every meeting that I have obviously is on calendars. But I'm getting to the place where prepping for those meetings or prepping for the thing that's coming up next is also on a calendar. Whenever for me, it's late at night. So like my 10 to 1 a.m. is calendared to a certain extent, because that's when I actually have time to work on the next day or the next 2 days. And lists on lists on lists and Google Docs. I just got endless lists. That's how I keep it together.
Well, I do know you are the king of Google Docs, because I have been a student of yours now for the last 6 or whatever it is, 8 months. And boy, do we have Google Docs. I have learned some things about how to organize Google Docs from what you have shared with us. So we are here together in this moment because also you have been my anti-racist leadership coach for the last year. And I have I'm so excited to talk about our work together in that regard. But before we do, I think it'd be awesome if you could share just a little bit about your background so that people know who you are and what this next step is that you're leaping into as you leave your principal job.
Yeah. So my story starts in the 80s in San Francisco, in the Tenderloin, for folks who know the area. Born and raised on the corner of Leavenworth and Turk. Lived there my whole formative years till I was 18. If you know the area, it's a place where people don't really think that they're children, but there are a lot of children there, and a lot of places that, are not the best places to grow up, but that's where I grew up along with a lot of other kids and everything that was going on there in the 80s, right? Where, it was, I don't know, I feel like there were no rules. There were no rules to follow for folks, at least there. So, a lot of crime, a lot of homelessness, a lot of drug use, a lot of drug sales, a lot of prostitution, a lot of hard times for a lot of people, right? So for me, that was the regular, unfortunately, not a glamorous thing. Don't believe any movies or music that glamorize that. It's not glamorous. It's hard. But I still was a school kid, so I found some sanctuary in school and found some success and found things to enjoy about it. And I was always into learning, we're just talking about like studying and all that kind of stuff. But I thought I was going to be a doctor for a long time, hence the OChem and chem and physics and calculus and you name it. And, studying, talking about, being in the study lane here, right? Like studying for the SAT, studying for the MCAT, the hit parade, all these fun things that were important once upon a time. So, I did all those things, for school, to go to college, all that stuff, right? And I decided that I wanted to go into education about my second year in undergrad. I thought I was going to be a surgeon for a long time, so much that like I was doing practice autopsies in the 10th grade.
Are you serious?
VA hospital and Stanford University in the summer. I was that kid in like those kind of programs. Whatever. So I was on that trajectory for a long time until I get to undergrad and start reading more about history, more about sociology, more about politics, more about my history as an African-American, a person of African descent in the continent of Africa. And then I decided that that's not what I want to do. Like I always wanted to do good work and do justice work, not even just like get money and be successful. Like I was still going into medicine to try to help folks that didn't have a good life, right? I didn't necessarily know all the terms then, but I knew I wanted to do something better than what was going on. But I realized that medicine was not fast enough for me or on the ground enough for me to do what I thought needed to be done in the world, right? So that led me to education. Teacher, high school Spanish teacher, go back to school, become a school leader. And, this idea of trying to right the wrongs. And, for me, the reason I would start my story with kind of where I grew up is as I got older, it was making sense of all those things, right? Like what was going on there? Like, why was my neighborhood like that? But I could go across town in San Francisco and not see that, right? Like, how can you be in a place where you have these mega skyscrapers, investment banking, Salesforce Tower, and also have people live in how they should not be living? So as a teacher, I was trying to address those issues as well, right? For me, I always kind of talk about being the teacher that the kids that I grew up with who didn't have success needed, right? And then as a leader, trying to be the leader of schools to try to redesign schools so that they're serving the kids that are not being served, right? Because like I had success and that's cool, it's great. My life is much easier than it could have been and very different than kids I grew up with, but they deserved greatness and they deserve success and self-esteem and access and financial freedom, just like anybody else does. But there's a reason they didn't get that. So that led me to leadership, and that kind of has led me to this kind of racial equity consulting kind of work, to still trying to get into the same question of what's wrong, why is it wrong, what's in the way of doing that? How do we fix it? And, you know, how do we all do what we can wherever we're in, whatever piece of the machine that we're in, you know? So I guess that's my story.
Yeah, well, and then fast forward to last summer. That's when I met you, and I forget who forwarded the email. Oh no, I remember. I do remember. I reached out to Zaretta Hammond, who is, you know, a tangential colleague of mine. She's an educator and an entrepreneur now, as you're coming into this fold as well. And I told her a little bit about how I was trying to think through some shifts that need to happen in my business, and did she have any ideas about who I might work with? And then she recommended you. So that's right. I forgot that.
Was that after the conference or before the conference?
That was before the conference, because then I saw it was before your second conference. So because you had a first conference that exploded bigger than you expected, right? How many people came to your first Dismantling White Supremacy?
Almost 1,000. It was kind of insane.
What was that like for you when you saw those signups coming in? Like, I can't imagine.
Me and my wife talk about it still today of like, how did that happen? I mean, literally, I was doing trainings in person with like 30 people, 50 people, 25 people, and the pandemic hits, and I was supposed to do a training in person again in June. That was what I was scheduled for. And the pandemic hits, and I say, well, you know, I don't know. We'll just see what this virtual thing is. It's like April, you know? And I'm like, well, whatever, you know, maybe we'll get some people here and try to do this training. Who am I, right? I'm a principal, right? Doing my third training, my third like full day training. Third or fourth, and I put it out there, and people just start signing up, and it starts catching fire. And then, you know, after the murder of George Floyd, the murder of Breonna Taylor, and, you know, the new reawakening of white America, everything goes on fire, right? Metaphorically and literally. And people are signing up. Like, there are days when like 100 people a day are signing up. And I'm just trying to follow this, trying to figure out, is this real? Am I being pranked? Is this a hack? Is this like a bot somewhere? Like somebody's playing a game on me? Like, this can't be real. And then we're just trying to keep up with this idea that whatever. So now I'm like hiring people and calling all my friends, and getting people to contract for me. And like I'm like, hey, I don't know what's going on, but I need help. Help me out. And we end up having a team of like 30 people to pull off this training with 1,000 people from across the country and the world.
Dude, it was so smooth. I mean, I know I saw your second take, so maybe the first conference wasn't as smooth as the second one, but I was just so impressed. I had never seen Zoom used the way y'all were using it, and now people are more used to having these big things on Zoom, but back then it was new. I mean, I'd been on it for 10 years or however long, but I'd never seen it used to that capacity before, and it just felt like you all were flowing. Was it just hours and hours of teamwork, putting your heads together to how you need to shift it for this many people?
Somewhat, and just like some innovation, you know, like for me, I kind of operated under, I want to do this thing. How do I do it? You know, which is how I normally attack problems, right? I want to get people, I want to get to a place where people can have a one-on-one conversation. What do I need to do that? Okay, Zoom only will allow you to have 50 rooms, which means I can only have 100 people per Zoom meeting, which means I now need 10 meetings, which means I need 10 people to open up 10 parallel Zoom meetings, share the links so people know where they're going, so they can have a one-on-one pair share, right? So like, for me, like what does it take to get there, and how do I set up the steps so that we can have that, right? So we just figured it out. You know, we use something, Google Docs crashes because you can't have 500 people on one document. You know, we discovered that the hard way. And then, you know, in real time, we're like, oh, we're just make 5 copies of this, and you're going to use this copy and this copy, and we're still doing it, you know, like, which is fun, you know, it was crazy. It's crazy, but it was amazing.
Mm-hmm. Well, and as a participant, like I said, I was just really, I was so impressed with the organization of it. And then I was really impressed with the way in which you all taught at multi levels. There was the spiritual, we were having some meditations, there was some body scanning, there was some, like, all of these things that I was like, it's California and we are radical in so many different ways. And this guy has pulled it all together, including what I would say, unfortunately, I think, is the radical notion of just naming white supremacy culture front and center rather than hiding under other easier diversity, equity, and inclusion kinds of terminology. So it was inspirational to be there, but it was also hard because hard stuff came up during the conference.
Yeah, I mean, that was the goal, right? Is trying to create a space that is so uncomfortable that growth is the only option, you know? And I think to your point around the variety of what was going on, part of that's trusting the people that I was working with and having relationship with all these people that people are like, hey, I think we should add this in. What about this show? I'm like, let's go. Let's figure it out. Let's do it, you know? And just trusting your people.
Mm-hmm. I didn't hear your last sentence. We had a little blip. You said, come on, let's go. And then I think you said one more thing. Did you?
Well, I said it's just having the people that you trust, right? Yeah. That can figure out what's needed and what's missing, right? Of like, Joe, well, we don't have anything around the body, right? And trusting people to lead, they can lead from and use their expertise.
Yeah. Well, there's so much I want to talk about, and I know our time is limited today. So I want to make sure that people hear about this summer's opportunity that you have put together that I thought last year was amazing. Talk to us about what you've designed this year.
Yeah, so, you know, I have a lot of crazy ideas. Last year was one of them. You know, this year I decided that, one, I want to answer this question of what comes next, right? So after we think about dismantling white supremacy culture, what are we rebuilding, right? And what are the building blocks of this new structure that we're creating? You know, what are the pieces to this puzzle? You know, how do we start to define like what anti-racism looks like, not just theoretically, right, but in practice, right? Both the daily practice and then at the policy level, right? So we're doing the intro and foundational series again, but we are answering this question now, the part 2, right? And there's going to be, I mean, we're doing all that. There'll be Bettina Love will do a keynote, and Dr. Ibram X. Kendi is going to do a Q&A session to answer questions about anti-racism in schools. Gholdy Muhammad's going to do a keynote on Friday, and now we're up to almost 20 workshops that are going to take place between Thursday and Friday on everything from discipline to teacher meetings to decolonizing the curriculum, ethnic studies transformation on the statewide level, all kind of stuff. I mean, it's pretty insane, and it's all day too, which is amazing. It's like, so we went from 2 half days to 5 full days of learning, and we got almost 550 people signed up so far.
Nice. And it's happening soon, right? June 14th, I think, is when the intro levels start.
Yeah, it kicks off on June 14th, Monday, 14 and 15. It's the whole week from June 14th to the 18th. But the returners who've done part 1 start on Wednesday, June 16, and then 17, 18, the whole week finishes.
Nice, nice. And so if people want more information to read up on that and to consider whether they want to sign up and participate, it is, Christine, I think you have the website to put up there. So we'll get it up there shortly. But there we go, dismantle, WSC, white supremacy culture. And actually, maybe let's just say, why do you think it's so important to go ahead and name white supremacy culture?
Because it's important to be clear with what we're trying to address, right? When we're staying on the surface of a problem, then we'll make surface level changes, right? Or no changes. But if we go below the surface of a microaggression, right? An incident of the policing a Black person, one student in special education, right? When we stay on the surface, we're looking at surface level changes, right? Or denying that change is even needed, right? But when we go below that and talk about a system and a cultural and a set of beliefs and practices that are led by white supremacy and lead to white supremacy, then we can ask ourselves deeper questions to say what needs to change so that we're changing the outcome, right? So the outcome is not yielding more white supremacy, right, and more subjugation of people of color, so we can have a conversation about what really matters, right, as opposed to things that we've been beating around the bush for decades, right, or centuries.
Yeah, it allows. I notice. I mean, well, I noticed a few things, and maybe we'll sort of slide in now to our conversation about our work together as coach and coachee. But I noticed that it has been scary for me. I've gone through this, like, didn't even know to name it, into getting really like naming it all the time, and then starting to feel different people's bristling when I name it, or what they either bristle, or, and this is with white people, I often see them, their eyes kind of go a little like I think it's an actual nervous system freeze, but they kind of glaze over a little bit, and then they're just like, why are you naming white supremacy? This isn't about them. And, you know, of course, them thinking that we're talking about like the kind of people who stormed the Capitol kind of white supremacy. And now what I've noticed is, rather than naming it all the time, I've softened a little bit. I pay just a little bit more attention to who I'm talking to. And I sometimes name it directly and sometimes build up, build up to actually naming white supremacy. Usually when I'm talking to white people, if I think they're going to glaze over, I ease in a little bit. I don't know if that's the right thing or not, but it feels like it's good to grab them before their brain goes offline versus shocking them. I don't know if you have any thoughts about that.
Yeah, definitely. I mean, I think it's a defense mechanism a little bit, right? It's a strategy. It's a strategic move in response to how people respond to being pushed, right, and questioned, right? What matters is where you stay, right? So if you stay in the place of like, well, I don't want to like get them there, then it never get there, right? And then the change never really happens, right? What I will say is, as we think about what conditions need to be present for white folks specifically not to respond with that kind of shut down, right, kind of mode, that's much more important, right? Because if we're always in the same conditions, the response of white fragility or white overwhelmment, right, or white rage is always that's always the consequence, right? So, and if you know my trainings, a lot of times I say, hey, you're probably going to want to give up at some point, right? You giving up supports the problem, though. So you actually need to be metacognitive with yourself and checked in with yourself so that you actually don't allow yourself to give up. Because I can't force you to not give up. You have to monitor that for yourself, you know? But when we don't say that, folks don't even know what's going on, right? They're just having, like you said, a neurological or socio-emotional reaction, right? And that's it's shut down, right? So building some skill is necessary.
Yeah. Well, and maybe that kind of like my trajectory, I think is maybe a common trajectory for at least white folks. I can't speak to others in terms of when we are starting to wake up, then we just get kind of, I don't want to say militant, but I'll use that word because I can't think of anything else about it. And now I'm getting more thoughtful and I'm getting more strategic about kind of how I play. But I really appreciate your point that it's like, if I just stay there, if I stay in that softer place, that's not going to help anyone either. So it's a matter of being strategic so that we can move in more.
And I'll say, can I say one thing about that? I think that's interesting though, is the difference with white people and people of color in that instance that you're in, that crossroads of like, do I push or do I not push? Right? Is that folks of color more times than not must be strategic, right? Because there's a system of systemic racism that actually can respond in very violent ways, right? And often does. Whereas for white folks, here's the thing that I've really been talking to white folks about recently is that you're convinced also that you can't push and that there's going to be dire consequences, but there's really not, right? There's really not, right? But the mind control piece is you thinking that you can only push so hard, right? But the truth is, when you realize, it's kind of like you realize your true power. When you realize that you actually have white privilege and you can use that to actually push on white people, and then after that, you're still white, you still maintain your white privilege, right? You're like, oh shit, like I can actually say things and I still get to have my privilege and I can continue, right? Then you're like, oh wow, then you have a very different amount of access to conversations, right? And then you really make white people uncomfortable. I mean, that's the beauty part. We're like, oh wow, we know when Gretchen comes around, we're gonna get it. I mean, you want to be that, right? As opposed to, yeah, we can say whatever we think about whatever, and Gretchen will never say a word. You know, like that's a much more interesting phase to get to, I think, for white progressive, white anti America.
Well, and in our coaching, one of the things that you've helped me do, and just so for the people listening know, and by the way, I do see there are some people listening right now. If you have questions, I do have my eye on the chat. So if you have questions or comments, you can participate in this conversation, even though Joe and I are gabbing. So please feel free to do that. But in our coaching, so I participated in your school leaders cohort. I got a number of the people in my Anti-Boring Educators Club to participate in your teacher cohort. And then you and I did one-to-one coaching as well. I think that's everything. And then I came to the conference last year. And so I think I have about 4 months under my belt of having, you talked to us about how to create norms that help create an anti-racist space. And I call those in my community care practices. And so now we have about 4 months of me naming those community care practices. There are 3 of them at the top of the call. And it's interesting to watch the conversation deepen and deepen as we go. And it's slow moving. And I'm also building my own skill and my own capacity to bring them up, to not rush through them, to take more time, to weave comments back to these practices. And I will name that I did not use the phrase white supremacy in mine. One of our 3 practices is to decenter dominant culture. And I have reasons that I did that I can share. I don't know if it's relevant to this conversation, but it has really enabled a deepening of our ability to look at what are all of the different oppressions that we as coaches who work with children get an opportunity to help decenter, and how can we more fully embody them. So I'm excited by the kinds of conversations that we're having in the club, but I would love to ask you to reflect a little bit about, if you're willing, like what growth you've seen in me, and also where you think my challenge point or my next step to push myself with would be.
Yeah, I mean, I think I've definitely seen a lot more reflection, and deeper reflection. I've seen a shift from reflecting to thinking about how to take some action. I think this idea of the practices of care, right, is an example of that, right? Because you're in a space regularly, right, that you either participate in, or in this case, you're leading and coordinating, and you have a responsibility, right, to hold that space and have that be a nurturing space, right? But there's a risk, right, in setting some expectations, right, and holding and asking folks to rise up to a higher level of self, right, a more conscientious, a more critical, a more reflective stance. So that shift I've appreciated seeing for sure. I've also seen the shift from, I guess, thinking that things can always be organic, to figuring out how to actually strategically and structure them so that you know that they're going to happen, right? So this idea of like, well, we'll see if the conversation gets there, versus I want to have this kind of a conversation with this person or with my group, right? Similarly, there's another side of that too, of like thinking that things need to be structured in a certain kind of way, and then trusting it to be organic at times, right? So there's a tension there, right? So I've definitely seen that kind of ebb and flow. I think one growth area, I think, is this idea of like, how much can you name race when you don't always have folks of color present, right? And I think this piece of, can you decenter whiteness and white supremacy culture even when it's only white people there, or majority white people there, right? I think that's a growth area, only because it's hard. It's more theoretical, and for the folks who you're working with, it's even more theoretical for them, because they're like, "Why are we even talking about this? I only have to talk about race after an incident of racism. I don't have to talk about it all the time, right?" So I think that's the growth area. Is like, how do you do that in a space? And then obviously the growth area always for everybody is, how do you do it in real time, right? When something happens, right? How do you name it? How do you reshift folks back to your practices of care, or the agreements, or our mission, right? And how do you do that in a way that is not just finessed enough to not, but like direct enough, jolting enough for folks to be like, oh, okay, it's clear that something happened that was not right, right? Because I do think sometimes we send this message that it's a little coddling, of like, hey, I want to give you some feedback here, just prepare yourself, so like it's not that bad, versus like, hey, you know what? This is not the space that we have here, that's the hardest part, right? Of knowing when to kind of be firm and push on folks. That's what comes to mind.
Well, it's interesting, because as you're talking, I wonder if I've had a little shift, because I actually feel like there's a way in which I'm more comfortable these days naming race in only white groups, and I feel a little shyer about it when there are folks of color present in the calls. I think I'm noticing that, because I think I've grown my own literacy enough that I feel I think it would be interesting to hear from some of the other folks in my training program. If y'all are listening, either the white folks or the folks of color, give me feedback about this. But I think there's still a shyness, like, oh, I might say something wrong, or also a shyness about, I don't want this person to have to watch white people fumbling even more around race right now. So let's skirt it, even though I know y'all are used to seeing it all the time, right?
Yeah, so I actually think this is pretty interesting, because I think it does relate to another growth area. Because what I was going to say is this idea, and it's right back to white supremacy culture, this quest for perfection, right?
Yeah.
Right. And I think, and this is heavy, not just with white supremacy culture, but with white people, right? This idea of like, I don't want to say it because it's not fully formed, right? And now it's hard, right? Because on one hand, white folks feel that way about race, but almost anything else, no, they don't feel that way. Like white people have no issue being the first person to talk when their ideas are not fully thought out, all the time, with any topic, right? With any topic, it's like, hey, I'm just thinking out loud here. I'm gonna talk for a really long time, and I don't know what I'm saying, but I'm just gonna say, because for some reason I feel like I just got good ideas, so I'm gonna talk, right? But when it's about talking about your reflecting, or about taking ownership, right? Or thinking about whiteness, all of a sudden I can't do that. So the push, and I think back to your question around growth area, it's just putting something out there. We've talked about this a lot of times in our conversations. Just put it out there, see what happens, right? And clean it up afterwards, and acknowledge that you messed up, and say, hey, you know what? I should not have said that. I recognize the impact of that. I want to do better, right? But put it out there, whether that is, we talked about like a mission statement, norms, right? A response after something, right? Just put it out there, because then you'll get to the next level of the second iteration of that, right? But if you're always preparing for the first iteration, maybe the first iteration never happens,
Right. Well, and this damn perfectionism thing, it's so true, everything you're saying. And oh no, I can't find it. It dropped. Oh no, here it is. I do have this list. I don't know is it going to be seen? There it is. The characteristics of white supremacy culture that I keep on my desk, and I ask myself to reflect about it. but I showed it just today in my training call because we were talking about the about perfectionism stopping us from making choices in our business. And I actually want to tell you about this because, well, as you know, and I'll say for the listeners, when we started coaching, one of my goals was that I wanted more folks of color in my anti-boring educator club and in my trainings. And it wasn't okay with me anymore that it was so many mostly cis white women. And we worked with that, and we sort of, that was my goal. And I was maybe gonna like reach out to all of the folks of color in my community and have interviews with people to find out a little bit more about what was working, what wasn't. And that ended up never happening because I was, as you mentioned before, looking for the more organic ways to have conversations, which ended up to be the right thing. But what I'm building to is today, Joe, we had our Rock Your Biz community call. And it was the first call that I've ever had where there were more folks of color in the room than white people at one point in the call. As I had to laugh because it's like, I gave up on that goal. I just worked on a bunch of other stuff. And then at the end of the call, it was me and 4 Black coaches who are building their businesses, needing accountability and worried about the ways in which perfectionism stopped them. And so actually, as I think about it, I did hold this up and I did show that perfectionism was the first one. And I said, look at all these ways that we all internalize these characteristics. And so, and then we brainstormed some ways that we can let go of perfection in our business building. But it felt fun to know that I was going to be talking to you tonight. And I had this moment that showed that, maybe I'm moving in the right direction here.
Yeah, and I'll say something that I think there's a few things that are this amazing about that. One, folks of color come to places where they believe it's going to be okay for them, right? Whether that's safety or support or nurture, right, or development, right? And we leave places that aren't that way, right? So there's something shifting if folks of color are coming, right? What's beautiful about that example, though, right, is what did they see when they came today, right? What was their experience, right? What did they notice, right? What kind of conversation was happening, right? And will they come back, right? And that's a conversation we've been having, right? But folks come back to places where they had a good feeling or they felt like it was kind of what they need, right? And what's feeding their soul, right? But talk about growth, right? What led you to the place where you were skilled enough and comfortable enough to have that conversation in that kind of moment, right? To kind of get there so that it actually feels authentic, so that you're not stumbling through words. I mean, that's like the growth, right? And how much preparation and conversation and scenarios and reflection got to that place, right? I mean, I think that's the beautiful thing, right? And they got to leave with it. Who knows what they went home and talked about, but they were not expecting. That's pretty cool.
Yeah, well, thank you for naming that. And I also guess I just want to name if any of them or anybody else who is on the call or listening, I'm open if you had a different experience than we're talking about right now. I'm open to you sharing that with me too, if you need to. I'm looking at the time and I'm seeing, I want to be respectful of your family life, but there's one more topic I don't want us not to talk about because I think it's really important, is the idea of affinity spaces. And I know that you have been doing some trainings on how to create affinity spaces. And actually, as I name that phrase, I bet there are people out there who don't even know what I'm talking about. But I'd love for you to just share with us a little bit, like, what are affinity spaces and why are they so important in institutional cultures?
Yeah, I mean, I think first thing I'll point out is the fact that that's a question is an example of white supremacy, right? And the ignorance and bliss and white privilege and the invisibility, quote unquote, of white privilege is that, right? Because if you ask a person of color, why do they need affinity space? It's like it's a rhetorical question. It's a stupid question to ask somebody, a person of color, right? Like, we have Chinatown because it's a cultural enclave, right?
Yeah.
To literally to both build community, but if it was safe, if it was safe for Chinese folks when they came to this country, right, to just be spread out and mixed amongst all the white people in white neighborhoods, they would have did that, right? But folks come together because there's something that folks get to when they come together, and there's some safety, right? There's some insulation, right? And there's the ability to kind of build and develop and maintain culture, right? And maintain self-esteem, right? That's an example of like a neighborhood and a whole group of people, right? But a cultural or a racial affinity space does that in smaller increments, right? Smaller pieces of time. So it's really just people coming together who have a shared cultural or racial affinity. Now you can have affinity spaces, of course, for folks from a similar sexual orientation background. It could be immigration status. It could be country of origin or country of location or gender, right? Class. But there's spaces for folks to be where they can just be. That's on the oppressed, subjugated side, right? Because when we're out mixing in the dominant space, we don't feel safe, right? We have imposter syndrome, right? We are stereotypes, so we have the threat of stereotypes, all those kind of things, right? We're discriminated against, right? When we create those spaces in institutions and organizations, now we're actually sanctioning and deeming this thing important for the people that are there, right? To now say, what do we do with that space? And it, you know, after we connect and heal and build community, now how can we use that for a space for transformation, right? How can we leverage a voice of a group of people that normally have a smaller voice or a marginalized voice to say, what do these people need in the space to change that space? Whether that's a group that speaks the same language in a group, an organization, a school, or an entire cultural or racial background. The white space, right? You might be able to get there, but white folks need to come together enough to recognize what whiteness is for them, what's coming up for them, and what are they going to do with their whiteness and their white privilege to shift the power balance, right? To work towards racial equity, right? But when white folks don't have to come together to have that conversation amongst white people, you don't have to. You don't. So it really is specific to kind of get there, you know, and it could be amazing, right? With some support, with some readings, with a facilitator, with some structure, and folks not giving up and checking out of the conversation, right?
Yeah. Yeah, well, and I remember that's one of the things that was really powerful about the conference that I went to last summer, was there were some situations that came up in group that needed to be deeply processed in affinity spaces. And I remember one time the affinity space, like we had gotten to the end, we white people were in our group, and we'd gotten to the time that we were supposed to come back to the main group, and the facilitator was given a message saying like, oh, the BIPOC group is needing a lot more time to continue processing. And so we got to have the feelings that come up around like, oh, we're on schedule, or oh, we're missing out, or, you know, whatever all of the things are. And or
even more so, like, why can't we go back, right? Like, what is this idea of not being in control, right? And not being the supreme group, all of those feelings, right? And having to sort through that and make sense of that. That's it, right?
Yeah. And that happened multiple times in our little short 2.5 days, and that you all just pivoted and worked with it and just modeled that process in front of us. And then we got to sit in those feelings. That to me was the biggest takeaway, and one of the reasons why I knew I wanted to move on and be in your leadership cohort. So you have shorter workshops around affinity spaces, right? Will you be having more of those?
Yeah, so we did a kickoff in December where it was kind of just an intro to affinity space and you know, what and why do we have them, and then we had a spring series, a 5-month series of supporting folks who are trying to lead them, and it was a monthly course for folks who, you know, want to lead them in their school or their department. We did another kickoff in May, we just finished, and we're gonna have a long course in starting in August, where it's the same thing. Help me lead this. How do I navigate the pitfalls? How do I troubleshoot it? What do I do when I get resistance? How do I start it? All those kind of things. So I'm realizing how important it is and how much support people need.
Yeah. Yeah, Christine, can you go ahead and put Joe's website up on the thing? Because I just really strongly recommend everyone watching to, at the very least, get on Joe's list, because there are lots of these workshops, big and small, depending on your time and depending on your budget, that are so interesting and helpful that will come across your desk. But if you are at all available starting the 14th for that week, please also look up the Dismantle White Supremacy Culture conference, which is the website that we have right now. And then your other one, it was trustleadership.com, I think, right? Yeah. Oh, and go ahead.
I was going to say, there you can kind of see workshops that are coming. There's different ones all throughout the year, some courses, and just sometimes I go back to blog, do a lot of blogging, but there's a lot of blogs on there too, just some, some interesting things.
Yeah, you'll have so much more time on your hands, maybe, when you're not a principal anymore, and maybe there will be some more blogging happening. We'll see. Well, I am excited that in our one-to-one coaching process, we have one session that's banked, right? So I'm not done seeing you yet, and I'm so curious when and how I might use that one session as I start or move more deeply into implementing everything we've worked on. But I just wanted to say thank you so much for your heart and your smarts and your time and attention and your honesty in our work together. I've just really appreciated growing in your presence.
Oh, much appreciated. Thank you for trusting me in that process, right, of being a thought partner, helping you think through whatever you're thinking through, and getting to see your growth. I mean, that's a special thing too, to share that process with someone. So I humbly appreciate that as well.
Well, I love Fest. And now I'm going to let you get back to your family, and I will see you tomorrow, because your teaching cohort is going to be doing their final presentations. And I'm so excited, just by the way, about what the two coaches who have been in your program have come up with. And I'm really excited to see the presentation. So thank you too for supporting them with that.
Oh yeah, definitely. Thanks for coming to see their growth of the year. That'll be awesome.
Yeah. I can't wait. And thank you, Aaron. We got our first comment. You two clearly make a wonderful team. Thank you, Aaron.
All right, cool. Thanks, Aaron.
All right. We'll take care, everybody. Bye-bye.
All right, thanks, Gretchen.